In 1927, the South African Parliament passed a law that made it a crime for two people to fall in love. Not to steal, not to kill, to fall in love. That single law would set off 100 years of surveillance, arrests, court battles, and quiet resistance that changed the country forever. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why South Africa is simultaneously home to one of the most progressive constitutions on earth and one of the deadliest places to be openly gay. Both of those things are true. Both of those things came from the same history. Let's start at the beginning. When the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910, the new state inherited a patchwork of colonial-era attitudes towards sex, race, and marriage from the British and the Dutch settler tradition. Sexuality was never treated as a private matter in this country. It was treated as a political tool. This wasn't new in 1910. Sexual regulation across the color line stretched back to the mid-17th century when the Dutch East India Company first established its slave-based colony at the Cape, and mixed relationships between settlers, enslaved people, and indigenous Khoikhoi communities were already being informally policed by colonial custom long before any single law existed. What changed after 1910 was the scale and the intent. The new Union government began drafting a wave of segregationist legislation covering land, labor, and movement. And sex was folded into that same architecture of control almost immediately. That formal criminalization arrived in 1927 when Parliament passed the Immorality Act, a law that made it a crime for a white person and a black African to have sex outside marriage. On paper, it was framed as a matter of public morality. In practice, it was one of the earliest legal building blocks of what would become apartheid 2 decades later. Using the bedroom to police the boundaries of race before the word apartheid had even entered the political vocabulary. And here's the twist almost nobody expects. This law, born in the 1920s as a relatively narrow statute, would keep getting stronger, wider, and more brutal for the next 6 decades. What happened next made things far worse. In 1948, the National Party rose to power, promising to formalize and intensify racial separation, and one of its very first targets was intimacy itself. The goal was explicit: protect what officials called racial purity by making interracial desire a criminal offense, and it functioned as one half of a matching pair, passed alongside the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act that same year, which banned interracial couples from marrying at all, even outside the country's borders. Police units were assigned specifically to enforce it, sometimes called the Immorality Squad. Investigators staked out homes, peered through windows, raided bedrooms in the middle of the night, and used torn bedsheets, overheard conversations, and neighbor testimony as evidence in court. Between 1950 and the law's repeal in 1985, at least 19,000 people were formally prosecuted, and thousands more were arrested without ever going to trial. The people most harmed were black women, who bore the brunt of exposure, prosecution, and social ruin, often while the white men involved faced lighter consequences, quiet reassignment, or none at all. Historians who have studied the era describe it plainly. This was never really about morality. This was the state deciding who South Africans were allowed to desire, allowed to love, and allowed to build a life with, and it was about to get even more personal. As the apartheid government tightened its grip through the 1950s and 1960s, its obsession with controlling sex expanded beyond race and into sexual orientation itself. In 1957, amendments extended the Immorality Act to criminalize even the attempt to have interracial sex, widening police power dramatically. Then, in 1969, the law was amended again, this time targeting gay men directly, criminalizing sexual acts between men under what became infamously known as the Men at a Party clause, which allowed police to arrest any group of men suspected of engaging in homosexual conduct at a gathering. Raids on private parties became a tool of state terror. Officers would burst into homes and private parties, arrest everyone present regardless of their direct involvement, and use the humiliation of public exposure as punishment in itself, regardless of whether a conviction ever followed in court. Newspapers would sometimes print the names of those arrested, ending careers and marriages overnight, long before any trial had taken place. For queer South Africans of every race, existing safely meant existing invisibly. Coded language, private networks, and homes with blacked-out windows became survival tools. And for black, gay South Africans, the machinery of apartheid attacked them on 2 fronts at once: race and sexuality, leaving almost no legal space to simply live, work, and love without fear of the state. But underneath the surveillance, something was quietly building. Resistance to this control didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly in private networks, underground gatherings, and eventually organized activism. Through the 1970s and 1980s, small gay and lesbian rights groups began forming, mostly among white South Africans, who had more room to organize without the added danger of racial persecution. Black queer South Africans, meanwhile, often found themselves fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, against a state that criminalized their race, and one that criminalized their desire. As the broader anti-apartheid movement gained international momentum in the 1980s, a fascinating alliance began to take shape. Anti-apartheid activists increasingly argued that a truly liberated South Africa could not simply replace racial oppression with new forms of discrimination, including discrimination based on who you loved. One of the clearest examples of this alliance came from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, already a global icon of the anti-apartheid struggle, who became an outspoken advocate for lesbian and gay rights, later comparing homophobia directly to the racism he had spent his life fighting and arguing that a church or a state that discriminated against people for their sexuality had no more moral standing than one that discriminated against them for their skin color. This idea, radical for its time, would go on to shape one of the most extraordinary legal transformations in modern history. In 1985, the government repealed the ban on interracial marriage and sex under mounting international pressure and domestic unrest, dismantling one pillar of control. Later reporting found that of roughly 900 people arrested under the interracial provisions of the Immorality Act, hundreds had been formally charged, brought to trial, and convicted before that repeal finally came. But another pillar, the criminalization of homosexuality itself, still stood untouched. That would not fall until an entirely new South Africa was born. Nelson Mandela's release in 1990 and the negotiations that followed set the stage for the most remarkable turn in this entire story. When South Africa's new constitution was drafted in the mid-1990s, activists pushed hard to ensure that the document protecting the country's newly won democracy would also protect sexual minorities, using the same moral logic that had just dismantled racial apartheid, that human dignity cannot be selectively applied. It worked. When the Constitution took effect in February 1997, South Africa became the very first country on earth to explicitly enshrine protection against discrimination based on sexual orientation directly into its constitutional Bill of Rights. Years before most Western democracies even debated the idea, sodomy laws that had criminalized gay men for decades were struck down by the Constitutional Court in 1998. Adoption rights for same-sex couples followed. It was a staggering reversal. A country that had spent 70 years using the law to police desire had just written the world's most progressive protections for it into its founding document. But writing rights into law and living those rights out in daily life turned out to be two very different battles. And the next one would take another decade to win. That next battle centered on marriage. In December 2005, in the landmark case Minister of Home Affairs versus Fourie, South Africa's Constitutional Court ruled unanimously that denying same-sex couples the right to marry violated the Equality Clause of the Constitution. The court gave Parliament exactly 1 year to fix the law, or the wording of the existing Marriage Act would simply be rewritten by judicial order. Parliament chose to act, and on the 30th of November 2006, the Civil Union Act came into force. South Africa became the 5th country in the world, and the first on the entire African continent, to legalize same-sex marriage, a continent where, at the time, homosexuality remained a criminal offense in dozens of neighboring nations, and still does in many today. It was a genuinely historic moment, and it hadn't come without resistance even inside the new democracy. Religious leaders and traditionalist politicians publicly opposed the bill on the floor of Parliament, and the compromise legislation that ultimately passed still allowed individual marriage officers to refuse, on grounds of conscience, to solemnize a same-sex union, a loophole LGBTQ+ organizations criticized for over a decade as undermining the very equality the law was meant to guarantee. It would take until 2020, under President Cyril Ramaphosa, for an amendment to finally close that gap and prevent officers from turning same-sex couples away outright. Still, the underlying achievement stood. A country that had criminalized gay sex within living memory of most of its own parliament had just become a global pioneer on marriage equality. And yet, while lawmakers in Cape Town were making history, a very different crisis was already killing hundreds of thousands of South Africans, one rooted just as deeply in the politics of sex, denial, and shame. Because, while South Africa's courts were expanding sexual freedom on paper, its government was actively worsening a sexual health catastrophe in practice. Thabo Mbeki became president in 1999, at the exact moment South Africa's HIV and AIDS epidemic was accelerating into one of the worst in the world. Rather than following the global scientific consensus, Mbeki publicly questioned whether HIV even caused AIDS at all, appointing a panel of AIDS denialist advisors and delaying the national rollout of antiretroviral treatment for years. His health minister discouraged proven medication in favor of unproven remedies like garlic, beetroot, and lemon. The human cost was staggering. Independent studies out of Harvard University later estimated that this denialism and delay resulted in over 300,000 preventable deaths. Into that vacuum stepped one of the most effective grassroots movements South Africa has ever produced, the Treatment Action Campaign, founded by HIV-positive activist Zaki Akmat in 1998. TAC took the government to court and won, forcing the state in 2002 to provide treatment to prevent mother-to-child transmission. It took until Mbeki and his health minister left office in 2008 for the treatment rollout to fully accelerate, a delay measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. It's one of the darkest chapters in this entire history, and it's directly tied to how a government chose to talk, or refused to talk, about sex, science, and shame. Even Nelson Mandela, who had largely stayed publicly quiet on the epidemic during his own presidency, later broke that silence dramatically in 2005, disclosing that his own son had died of AIDS-related illness and urging South Africans to speak about the disease openly rather than in whispers. A direct rebuke, many observers noted, of the culture of denial his successor had spent years reinforcing. In the years after 2008, South Africa's HIV response transformed dramatically. Mother-to-child transmission rates plunged from dangerously high levels down to around 3.5% by the early 2010s, and the country eventually built the largest antiretroviral treatment program in the world by sheer scale. On paper, this looked like redemption, a nation correcting a catastrophic mistake through science and activism. But a new painful pattern was emerging at the same time. Even as the law protected LGBTQ+, South Africans more than almost anywhere else on the planet, everyday violence against them was rising in plain sight. Black lesbian women in townships became targets of so-called corrective rape, a brutal practice meant to punish and cure women of their sexual orientation through sexual violence, a phrase that itself reveals how deeply sex, punishment, and control remained tangled together in South African society. Generations after apartheid's laws were repealed, transgender South Africans faced a parallel struggle. While the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act of 2003 gave people a legal pathway to change their registered gender, activists spent years afterward documenting how slow, humiliating, and inconsistently applied that process actually was in practice, especially for those without money or legal support. Sex workers, meanwhile, remained fully criminalized under laws dating back decades, even as public health researchers argued that criminalization itself was driving violence against them further underground. Legal equality had arrived on paper, piece by piece. Social safety had not caught up, and that gap is still tearing families and communities apart today. Before we get to the present day, there's one more thread worth pulling on. How South Africa's transition to democracy actually dealt with the sexual violence of the apartheid era itself. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which held hearings through the late 1990s to document the abuses of the apartheid system, has been criticized by scholars in the years since for largely treating sexual violence as a footnote rather than a central form of political violence. Testimony about rape, forced sterilization campaigns targeting black women, and sexual humiliation used against detainees in police custody surfaced during the hearings. But researchers have since argued the commission's structure, built primarily around individual acts of killing and torture, wasn't well designed to capture how deeply sexual violence had been woven into the machinery of racial and political control. In other words, even the country's landmark reckoning with its own past struggled to fully reckon with this particular part of it, a gap that historians and gender violence researchers are still working to fill today. That unfinished reckoning helps explain why, decades later, the pattern keeps repeating. That gap has continued directly into the present. In February 2025, Muhsin Hendricks, the world's first openly gay imam, a man who had spent decades helping LGBTQ Muslims reconcile faith and identity, was shot and killed in Gekeberha as he left to officiate an interfaith wedding. Later that same year, in December 2025, a 16-year-old queer teenager named Kwakanya Malanganisi was murdered in Khayelitsha in what activists widely believe was a hate crime, after reportedly being targeted with slurs before the attack escalated. Court proceedings into both cases were still unfolding well into 2026. Part of a pattern advocacy groups have flagged again and again. Cases involving queer victims frequently stall, get delayed, or end in acquittal despite eyewitness testimony, echoing an earlier case in 2024 where 5 men accused of murdering another queer teenager walked free due to what courts called insufficient evidence. Meanwhile, South Africa's broader gender-based violence crisis, rape, intimate partner violence, femicide, continued to be described by human rights monitors in 2025 as a country where survivors face what researchers called systemic inefficiencies, blocking justice despite some of the most progressive laws on the books anywhere in the world. And yet, this story doesn't end purely in tragedy, because the same tension that has defined South African sexuality for over a century, the gap between law and lived experience, is still actively being fought over in real time in 2026. In June of that year, South Africa's parliament publicly declined to endorse a regressive African regional charter that sought to roll back protections for sexual and gender minorities across the continent, with one South African lawmaker stating plainly that the charter conflicted with the country's constitution. New national survey data collected between late 2025 and early 2026 found that the share of South Africans who admitted they might personally target a transgender person with violence had dropped from 8% a decade earlier down to just 3%. A real measurable shift in public attitudes, even as activists warn that legal protection and physical safety still don't fully overlap. A courtroom in Johannesburg convicted a public figure of hate speech, harassment, and unfair discrimination against LGBTQ+ people that same year over a series of public statements and a threatening march through a Johannesburg neighborhood. A landmark use of South Africa's Equality Court that activists hailed as proof the legal tools built in the 1990s could still be made to work, decades later, if survivors and communities kept fighting to use them. At the same time, campaigners were documenting a slow but real shift in public opinion. A national survey found that South Africans who described themselves as familiar with an LGBTQ+ person in their own lives were now far more likely to support full legal equality than those who weren't, suggesting that 2 decades after the Civil Union Act, visibility itself was doing some of the work that legislation alone couldn't. The fight that began with the 1927 law criminalizing interracial love has become, a century later, a fight over whether constitutional promises can actually be lived out safely on the ground in townships and courtrooms, rather than just on paper in Pretoria. So what does 100 years of this history actually add up to? It's the story of a state that once used the bedroom as one of its most effective instruments of control, deciding by law who could touch whom, who could marry whom, and who could simply exist without fear of arrest. It's the story of a resistance movement that refused to separate the fight for racial freedom from the fight for sexual freedom, and won both, writing protections into a constitution that, on paper, remains one of the most progressive documents in the world. And it's the story of the enormous, unfinished distance between what a country's laws promise and what its citizens actually experience, a distance measured in the tens of thousands of Immorality Act prosecutions of the 20th century, the hundreds of thousands of preventable AIDS deaths under Mbeki's denialism, and the names of Musa Hendricks and Kwakanya Mlanganisi in the 21st. South Africa didn't just legislate sexuality. For 100 years, it fought, punished, denied, and eventually redefined it, one law, one court case, and one life at a time. From the immorality squads staking out bedrooms in the 1950s, to the constitutional court judges writing equality into law in the 1990s, to the activists still marching every November during 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the same underlying question keeps resurfacing in every generation. Who gets to decide who you're allowed to love, and who gets to keep you safe once you do? South Africa answered that question more boldly and more contradictorily than almost any nation on earth. Whether that redefinition finally reaches everyday safety for every South African in every province, regardless of race, gender, or who they love, is the chapter still being written right now. One court case, one protest, and one life at a time.